Hi everyone, my name is Atticus Murphy, and I'm a graduate student at Tufts University with Elizabeth Crone. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how monarch butterflies prefer to enter host plant patches. But first, I'll begin by talking about how movement behavior more generally underlies habitat use. So in particular, if we think about habitat restorations, here we have on top a prairie restoration and on bottom is a wetland restoration. If we want to know, for instance, how will individuals use new habitat, we need to know about their movement. We need to know how they move through the landscape and locate habitat patches, and then what do they do once they're inside the habitat patch? How long do they stay, etc. And there's an applied corollary of this question, which is how can conservation efforts best provide useful habitat? We have limited resources. How can these efforts be directed towards providing habitat that is productive for the species? One way in which behavior underlies habitat use is through edge-mediated behavior. So if we imagine this forest fragment here is high-quality habitat, we could draw a red line around that high-quality habitat, and we could ask, what is the probability that individuals from low-quality habitat will enter the high-quality habitat at the edge, and vice versa? This would be a question about edge preferences. Do animals choose high-quality habitat at edges? And importantly, the edge here is not a habitat type in itself. It's not somewhere that animals live in this conception. It's simply the boundary between two habitat types here, between forest and not forest. Why would this matter? Well, for one thing, edge preferences increase occupancy time. Occupancy time is the length of time that an individual spends in a patch of a given size. So if we imagine this butterfly has entered a patch of its host plant, imagine a cartoon butterfly here, this blue one from a species without edge preference, you might expect that after moving through the patch for some period of time and laying eggs on the host plant, it encounters an edge and has some probability of exiting the patch. If instead we imagine a red species that does have edge preferences, then the red species may encounter the edge several times before eventually exiting the patch. And this clearly increases the amount of time that the red individual was inside the habitat patch. For continually reproducing organisms, this increase in occupancy time directly leads to fecundity in the habitat patch. So longer time spent inside the patch means more time laying eggs inside the patch, and so has higher fecundity. The red individual in this cartoon example would have higher fecundity. Now, to make that cartoon a real butterfly, my study system is the monarch butterfly, which is unfortunately an iconic pollinator in decline. It's native to the United States, and it lays eggs exclusively on milkweed. And it likely is continuously egg-laying throughout its adult life after mating. So it fulfills that criterion that I mentioned on the last slide. These butterflies overwinter in Mexico, and they have a yearly multi-generational recolonization of much of the eastern United States. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the species is declining, and it's thought that this might be, at least in large part, due to habitat losses. For instance, here is a graph of habitat lost to agriculture over a 4-year period, and you can see that there are thousands of acres of habitat being lost throughout the Midwest, which is an important source of monarch butterflies. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be discussing whether monarch butterflies have preferences at edges between milkweed and grassland, milkweed and meadow, and if so, how strong are these edge preferences? Second, I'm going to be using a simple model to ask how does this edge preference alter occupancy time, so addressing the ecological consequences of any edge preference. So to ask the first question, all we need to do is release monarch butterflies at edges, and then we can ask whether they choose to move into milkweed or out of milkweed. So it's sort of like a binary choice experiment. We do this by capturing wild female monarchs, females because they are the egg layers. We chill them and mark them, and then we release them at the edge between milkweed and meadow. We follow them from a distance, and by dropping flags every few seconds or at every landing point, we can create this geocoded path. So here we have in green, the green area is the milkweed patch, the red circle is the release point, and the colored lines are the paths that the monarchs took based on our flagging. We can draw a circle around the release point and then calculate the percentage of the circle that's inside milkweed, and also record whether the monarch was in or out of milkweed when it crossed this 5-meter circle. So then we can create a milkweed preference scale that accounts for the percentage of the circle that is in milkweed. Our results indicate that 15 monarchs went into the milkweed and 6 went out. This translates to a milkweed preference of 0.8, which is a significant bias towards moving into milkweed. You can see on this graph, the dashed line at 0.5 would indicate no preference. Below the line would indicate a preference for low quality habitat, so not milkweed. And above the line indicates a preference for high quality habitat. So how strong is this preference? Well, this preference of 0.8, we can compare it to some past edge releases, which were done by Rees and Dubinsky in 2001. We can convert them to our preference scale, which is again 0 to 1, where 1 is a perfect milkweed preference. And we can compare to their Prairie versus Rhodes releases, which had a preference of 0.44, so no preference. Their Prairie versus Fields decision was 0.58, so a moderate but not significant preference for Prairie. And Prairie versus Forest, where they observed a 0.79 preference for prairie over forest, open habitat over closed habitat. So our observed preference for milkweed over meadow is similar to the preference for prairie versus forest. So do monarchs have edge preferences? Yes, they do. And the preference we estimate is about 0.8 on a scale of 0 to 1. Next, we're going to address the ecological consequences of this using a simple model. That model it comes from Otso Oveskainen's 2004 ecology paper, which made a couple assumptions in order to actually make some equations so we can solve for occupancy time. The assumptions are that the landscape is classified into habitat and matrix, that motility differs between habitat and matrix, so the rate of movement differs, and that there's preference at the edge. And then we start individuals at the edge of a perfectly circular habitat patch with some radius, just like in this cartoon diagram on the left. The equation itself looks like this. Here, H is habitat, M is matrix. We're solving for occupancy time, T. Mortality is indicated by mu. Alpha is the square root of the ratio of mortality to motility. R is the patch radius, so occupancy time is a function of patch radius. Bigger patches have longer occupancy times. And delta is approximately equal to edge preference times alpha times motility. And it's only approximately equal in our case because the measurement in the field of the probability of monarchs entering the milkweed patch is only approximately equal to the number required in this model. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So parameterizing this occupancy time model, we have a survival number here from Altizer and Oberhauser in 1999, and you can see that this is a very small number because it is a rate of mortality per second. Then we have motility in the habitat and then the matrix, which is from our lab's unpublished data. You can see that motility is about 10 times higher in the matrix, so the monarchs slow down when they're near host plant. And we have our approximation of K, which is 0.25. And the way we approximate this is by taking our preference, which is 0.8, and the preference for habitat can be converted into K approximately by taking the ratio of the preference for matrix to the preference for habitat. So here that's 0.2 for 0.8 over 0.8, and that equals 0.25 here. Edge preferences increase occupancy time in this case, as in many cases. So here we have on the y-axis occupancy time in hours, and on the x-axis patch area in hectares. So 0 to 1 on both scales. And in the blue line we have monarchs with edge preference, and in the yellow line we have all the same parameters but without an edge preference. And you can see that there's a really substantial increase in the amount of time spent in a patch. And just for context, a half-hectare patch is about the biggest patch of milkweed at my field sites in New England. So what does this mean ecologically? We mentioned that longer occupancy time should lead to more eggs laid. And if we make some assumptions, we can get a rough idea how many more eggs we're talking here. So if we assume female monarchs stop to lay eggs continuously during flight, they have a 24-day lifespan, takes them 3 days to mate, and they have then 21 days of egg laying at a constant rate, then we can just do a simple calculation of 400 eggs over their life, 21 days to lay them, we say 2 hours of flight per day, then you have 9.5 eggs per hour. And then using this simple multiplication, we can just say, convert the time spent in the patch to eggs laid in the patch. What we see is that, so without edge preference versus with edge preference, our k-value without edge preference is 1, and our k-value with edge preference is 0.25. That's that ratio earlier I was telling you about, and it's approximately equal to 0.25. And without edge preference, in that half-hectare patch, kind of the best patch that I've seen, we would have a 7-minute occupancy time predicted by the model. With edge preferences, we have a 27-minute occupancy time. And that translates, using our rough calculation, to a difference in quadrupling the number of eggs. So without edge preferences, we would expect 1 egg to be laid in the patch, and with edge preferences, we would expect 4 eggs to be laid in the patch. So a pretty substantial increase. To conclude, female monarchs have a strong preference at milkweed meadow edges. We estimate 0.8 on a scale of 0 to 1. Edge preferences substantially increase the amount of time spent in milkweed habitat. And this also increases the number of eggs laid. We just estimated roughly quadrupling in the number of eggs laid. This preference is strong, but it is imperfect. So monarchs that enter a patch won't stay in the patch forever. They will eventually leave. In the future, I'd like to refine and expand these results. So first, I can refine the relationship between edge preference in the field and the simplified model I just showed you. So that our k-values were approximate. As I mentioned, there are some complicated corrections that we can do using their movement statistics. And we can also estimate in the field the range over which edge preferences occur. So how far away from the edge are monarchs exhibiting this bias towards milkweed? Separately, I'm also interested in studying movement in urban and natural landscapes and comparing the two, with the goal of understanding how various habitat types can contribute to population viability in our increasingly fragmented world. And with that, I'd like to say thanks to these lovely people, and I'd be happy to answer your questions online.